In my early 20s, I struggled a lot with anxiety and panic attacks, right? And the more that I really dove into it, I realized that I was experiencing that when I felt really, really guilty for not working.
It's only a matter of time.
We meet in an hour of change and challenge.
Every precious minute on the surface was programmed.
I'm Emily, Marketing Coordinator of Undock, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with the one and only Mike Szczesniak. Mike is a CEO, coach, and speaker with a huge passion for productivity. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's jump right into it. Our first question is, when and why did you first begin your journey as an entrepreneur?
Two different times. So the first company I ever started was in 5th grade. I used to make duct tape wallets and sell them around middle school. And yeah, it's really, really fun times. I actually ended up taking 2 buddies on as partners so we could scale it, right? But so I was always in sales. I was always growing organizations and things like that. And even through the beginning of my journey when I worked in corporate America, I was always building businesses and trying to create things. So I guess technically 5th grade, but there have been multiple different points.
That was a great story.
Oh, best duct tape wallets in the business. We had features. I had Velcro latches, coin purses. Man,
I'll have to
dominated
email
that
about
market.
that later.
100%.
Okay, so second question. Why does managing productivity matter?
That's a deep, deep question for me. Long story short, in my early 20s, I struggled a lot with anxiety and panic attacks, right? And the more that I really dove into it, I realized that I was experiencing that when I felt really, really guilty for not working, right? And the more that I unpacked that and reverse engineered that, the more I realized that if I could have shown up more powerfully in the time that I was working and maybe paired that with a little bit more of a realistic expectation based on what I wanted to create, the whole game would have changed for me. So I had this really skewed perception of what productivity meant, right? I thought it was to-do lists and getting things done and having things in the calendar and being busy. Those are great as long as they're things that actually matter, right? So I realized if I reframed that and maybe built some skills and strategies around that to boost it, I wouldn't have had to go through what I struggled through. And that's probably why it's such a passion point for me and why I've really built my business around that. But yeah, it's something that I'm super, super passionate about because I wouldn't wish that on anyone. And I've been blown away by how common anxiety is in the entrepreneurial space. And for me, I could have alleviated a lot of that if I was able to boost and reframe productivity.
So why do you think that anxiety is such a prevalent problem among entrepreneurs?
I think because as entrepreneurs, we're really high achieving, right? We have massive goals and massive expectations. And that's great. That's why we create amazing things. But at the same time, if they're not kind of put into perspective, at times they can almost work against us. And having that awareness, that self-awareness is really, really key. But yeah, I think it's just that high achieving nature of entrepreneurs that allows it to start to spiral if we don't keep it in check. Anxiety is one of those weird things, right? Where people always ask me how did you get away from it? I don't really necessarily believe that you always do. You just figure out how to manage your thoughts a little bit better. And you can't really pinpoint one thing that changed the game. But I'm extremely confident that productivity played a massive role of that. Understanding what I wanted to create, understanding what I had to do to get there, and understanding how I can really leverage and structure my time a little bit more efficiently to get there. It's everything. So it's tough to give a real answer to that. It's just it was just such an important piece of the journey for me.
No, that's a great answer. Explain the results engine and when you realized there was a market for assisting entrepreneurs with their productivity.
The results engine is my coaching program, and it's really the business. There are a couple of programs that live within it, but that's my business. Now, I'm a certified high performance coach, so I help busy entrepreneurs and executives just get to the next level, whatever that means for them. That's what I do in the results engine.
Right. Okay. You've said more is not a strategy. What do you mean by that?
So often I'll be talking with a potential client or a colleague, and I'll ask them, like, what's the strategy? Like, how are you going to get where you want to go? Like, we know we've already outlined where you want to go. What's the plan to get there? And so often I'm just like, they just say, I want to do more, right? Like, I want to do more of like XYZ goal. And yeah, I don't resonate with that. Like, more just isn't a strategy. Like, you can't just say, I need to do more of XYZ. It's like, okay, what are the steps? What are we going to do in detail? Because if there's no clarity around the goal and around the action items, like, how are you going to map to the goal? Because oftentimes what we pair with that word more is a super generic topic, right? It's like, I'm going to do more prospecting. Well, what does that mean? Like, what are you going to do? What are the action items? And I think that's kind of where I went with that piece of content. But the message was really the same as everything. Like, seeking clarity, getting super clear on what you need to do is everything. If you don't know what you need to do, everything's going to drop. When you have clarity, everything rises. It's like, what's that saying? Like, all ships rise with the tide or something like that. Like, clarity's the tide. And when you have clarity, everything changes.
That's so true. And more is such a broad term. So
Yeah.
it could overwhelm some people, and then they might not even get around to doing whatever that more is. So I totally agree with you. You need to have a plan always.
Yeah. And oftentimes when we say more, it's like really partnered and coupled to this amount that's not sustainable. People always ask me, like, what's the number one thing I can do? I want to boost productivity. I want to get more done, get more out of my days and out of my hours. And honestly, it's like, we're just focusing on the wrong things, right? And it goes back to the clarity aspect. When we're talking about time management and productivity, there are like countless strategies that we can do, right? But it doesn't matter if the things that we're doing with those strategies, and what I mean by things, I'm talking about action items, if they're not in line with what we want to create, then it doesn't matter. And it goes back to that perception of productivity I talked about earlier, like being productive and effective versus just busy. And if we want to boost productivity, we need to, it's not just getting things done. It's like getting the right things done. So it's always like, go back to seeking clarity. There are a number of different strategies you can do in terms of getting clear on what you need to be doing or what you want to create and all these things. But the biggest downfall or the biggest problem I see people struggling with is like, they're not focusing on what they should be focusing on, which is get really clear on what you want. And then you can start to implement time management strategies and maybe like time blocking, or introduce some exercise or different elements that you can boost your energy a little bit, like all these things. But they're all for nothing if we're not going to take them and transition and translate it into activities that matter.
This is actually a perfect segue into our next question, which is, if an entrepreneur wants to begin improving their productivity right now, what would you recommend as the first step?
Yeah. So it's the same answer for me. It's oftentimes you'll feel clear, but I just believe there's always another level. So I would always step back and say, okay, well, what do you actually want to create? And then get hyper focused on what activities will get you there. Right. And there are a couple different strategies. Like I mentioned, I was sharing an exercise in this video on Instagram yesterday. It's called like My Dream Is exercise. And literally, like, take your phone out and set a timer for like 3 minutes. And you just need a pen and paper, write out my dream is, and then just fill in the blank. And literally line by line, every line starts with my dream is. Just write it down, 3 minutes, write everything that you can think of. And then just go back after the 3 minutes is up and start to look for some parallels and start to look for some trends and some commonalities. that's just one strategy you can use, but get hyper focused on what actually matters, because then you can kind of step into a lot of the other upgrades, which is, again, like I mentioned, like you could do time blocking, you could do like some quick exercises, you could do meditation, like any of these things to get more control over your thoughts and boost your energy is great. But you always need to start with clarity, is my belief.
Definitely going to try that tactic after this interview.
Awesome.
If you could go back in time to give yourself advice, when would it be and what's the advice? I know, a loaded question.
I would probably go back to like the beginning of my career in corporate and the beginning of what I would call like adult entrepreneurship, like building real businesses and not just like slinging duct tape wallets in middle school. And I would kind of, well, I'm going to give two because I just thought of an even better one, but I've already started this.
Go for it.
I would say trust the process because everything's going to work out. And then number two, I would tell myself to basically kick fear to the curb and find a way to invest in myself heavily earlier. That's been the way that, yeah, that is the way that I have cut learning curves the most dramatically, is figuring out how I can invest in myself at a high ticket level, get mentorship from people doing exactly what I want, get around people doing what I want, learn as much as I can from them. That changed the game for me. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate. Like there can be a lot of fear around a 4 or 5 figure investment. And I would have just told myself like, hey, you'll figure it out. And obviously do this responsibly. I'm not telling anyone to just take on like $10,000 in debt for no reason, but yeah, that's what I would say. I would find a way to invest in myself and bet on myself earlier.
That's great advice. And the mind is really the biggest competition, right? Okay,
100%.
second to last question. You're doing great so far. Almost there.
Thank you.
What's your time diet? In other words, what do you cut back on or add into your schedule in order to stay productive?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question to me right now, especially in the entrepreneurial landscape, because oftentimes the things that we need to cut back are a lot of what we're doing on our phones, right? But the catch-22 is a lot of us build our businesses on our phones, right? Like social media is massive now from a personal branding and positioning play. So how do you kind of decipher between like, am I mindlessly scrolling on Instagram or am I creating and providing value to my audience? So it's really difficult to answer that question. But for me personally, like my like black hole on the internet is YouTube. Like I love consuming content from YouTube, and luckily most of what I like to consume is like podcasts. Like I can rationalize it as valuable, but that's something that I always am kind of getting conscious about removing a little bit more out of my diet, I guess. That's my thing.
That's so true. And I feel like that rings true to everyone, not just entrepreneurs. It's tough as humans with the technology we have these days.
100%.
If you had 25 hours per day and everyone else had 24, what would you do with the extra hour?
So if I were at a different place in my life, it might be spend more time with family, or maybe like spend more time like doing some sort of activity or volunteering or all these things. And those are all extremely important. And they're the reason that right now it would be a business thing. So I would focus that hour right now in whatever area of my business needs more attention. Because again, it's the same thing as the investment thing. Like I'm all about cutting learning curves and like shortening time windows. So if I can devote an extra hour to a piece of my business that needs a little extra time, and I can, over the long term, maybe cut down the window of where I want to get to by a couple years, that's that's massive for me because my family is the number one most important thing in my life. So that will like create all that extra time for my family. So I'll be able to afford those experiences with my family earlier. My number one life pillar is impact over income. So like from a philanthropic standpoint, I have more time to devote. I have more financial resources to devote. And I personally believe in building for-purpose companies where there's some sort of philanthropy baked into the fabric of the company. So as the company grows faster, I get to give more faster. So it would be business related for me right now because I'm just in a big growth mode.
That was a perfect way to close this interview. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. Where can viewers find you online?
That'll just be MikeSczesniak.com, but anywhere on social media, I'm just Mike Szczesniak everywhere. Biggest platforms for me are Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
Great. So definitely go check him out. He's popping on Instagram. That's how we found him.
Awesome.
He's a hit in our office. And of course, if you want to check out more about Undock, you can go to undock.com or at Undock HQ on social media.